Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. On this week's episode, we continue to dive into harassment and bullying in the general story or the experience that happened to me. I preface this with the fact that these things in work environments do take place. Harassment and bullying can happen. I'm not focused necessarily on airing dirty laundry, but what I am focused on is telling my story to explain how it later impacted me. So I hope that you enjoy today's episode as we continue to build on what the impacts of harassment and bullying can look like. If you didn't get an opportunity to listen to last week's episode, I would implore you to listen to that before you listen to today's. It will make more sense, trust me. As always, I thank you for your support as you join me on my journey, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. The following morning, I had met with that individual, that trusted source that I had emailed the night prior while I had spoke to that supervisor that was irate and in this space of just pure anger and most likely addiction at the same time while he was intoxicated. Now, this person had mentioned in that moment that things definitely were not going to get better anytime soon, and that it was this person's belief that this was purely a personal vendetta deeply rooted in a mental health issue, and that the actions and thoughts that were directed in my way were completely uncalled for and unprofessional and unwarranted. I knew from that space that the first step that I would need to take following this was a meeting was going to have to be had with this individual in an attempt to try and calm the situation. Prior to this meeting taking place, I recognized that I wasn't going to be able to go in and have this discussion alone, and that a third party would be needed. I had actually in that moment asked a supervisor to join me. And the reason I did this was that I knew I needed an unbiased party in that room with me. I now acknowledge too that in that moment I may have held fear and did not feel safe around this individual anymore as his behaviors were escalating. So in an effort to diffuse the situation as soon as the meeting took place, I offered an apology. And I did this as a gesture of trying to find common ground. In that moment, I didn't understand why he was so irate. The idea behind the apology was that I actually had wanted to initiate or start this meeting from a calm place, a one of compassion. And I apologized. I apologized and I said, I am sorry for whatever I have done that has put you in this position where you clearly have some issue with me. I don't understand what that issue is. If you want, take the time and tell me what that issue is right now. And that person was unable to drum up any issue in that moment. I asked once more, I said, is it a performance issue? He said, no. Is it a personal issue? He said, no. I said, then what could possibly be going on that you have this much anger around me when I come to you and have discussions that are very relatively peaceful in nature? He replied that he was overwhelmed at work, overwhelmed in life, struggling because people weren't answering their cell phones after hours, Struggling because people weren't getting back to him when he wanted them to after hours. And in that moment, I saw more of his struggle than an issue with me. And I actually thought this poor man is struggling to some degree and is asking for help. I acknowledged in that moment, it appears that you are struggling. What do we need to do to help you? And the response I got was, answer your phone after hours. And I replied, absolutely I will, when there's a reason. I said, we need to get better at this. We need to have a valid reason why we're calling each other after hours. Our time off needs to be respected. And again, the anger would come out. And I offered finally, I said, this meeting isn't really going to go anywhere. I understand that. I recognize that. So let's take a break. At the same time that had happened, shortly after that moment, and again, I heard this from this trusted source, that member was now going to upper management and saying things that were false about me, that I did not deserve to be on the team and I should be removed. That source that told me these things was asked to support this dialogue, this idea about myself. And that person said, no, I do not support this. He stood his ground. And the story doesn't end there. Shortly after that, as I believe alcoholism continued to increase, one day that same individual that was fraying on all ends, losing his grasp with his own mental health, his inability to lead, inability to have compassion for others, awoke one morning, unable to find his pass to get into the building, had sent myself and another member an email asking to look for that pass as he was late for work, which was now an incredibly common occurrence. The two people that received that email, myself and my other friend on the team, were actually tied up in the early morning hours and unable to respond to that email or see it in the moment as we were busy. I didn't know this had taken place until after, but in that moment, that individual had come into work and grabbed a temporary pass and came up to our floor. Filled with rage that no one had gotten back to him, most likely hungover or intoxicated from the night before, charged my coworker physically. The impact of him being charged, I'm not going to speak about. That's his story. But after that had happened, I know for a fact, because he had told me, that he had told that supervisor that what he had just done was wrong, unprofessional, uncalled for, unwelcomed, and that should never happen again. In that moment, that same supervisor most likely dismissed those comments and said, "Where's Nate? I'm going to go do the same thing to him." And in that moment, I just so happened to be coming up the elevator back to my work desk with a coworker who witnessed this entire event. And as we walked down the hallway, eventually this supervisor met us in the hallway. His hands were clenched, his arms were straight down, almost locked in a position. He appeared to be filled with rage as he turned and charged me. In that moment, I actually believed that I was going to be attacked by this individual first thing in the morning. I was hit with shock and disbelief. But due to the seriousness of the pace that he was charging me at, I actually braced myself. I widened my stance. I put one foot out in front of the other. And I planted myself in the ground and I put my hand out to create distance. And I told him to stop. And that's when the yelling began, as he pressed up against my hand, trying to inch closer to me, trying to intimidate me, my partner beside me, in disbelief as well. He attempted to tear a strip off of me in regards to this pass and email that he had sent to me. The intensity of his anger was so real that I knew that I couldn't even address the pass in this conversation, that none of the words that I would say would register. I had seen this look enough in my career. I knew how to de-escalate people that were in this state. So I lowered my voice. And I simply said, "Did you find your pass? Did you find your pass?" And he screamed, "Yes." And I said, "Good. We can talk about the rest of this later." And I turned and I walked into that office, knowing that that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That this person had become completely unhinged. And that I needed to step forward and ask for help. For him. Harassment and bullying happened to me. What I didn't understand in that moment, though, was the impact of it. The anxiety that would come from these moments. The panic attacks that would come from this creation or this idea that I was no longer safe at work after feeling like I had just been attacked at work or gotten close to that point. And seeing active addiction in full swing. That same friend and coworker that stood beside me that day that saw this event, saw this charge, pulled me aside after that had happened, once things had calmed down, and asked if I was okay. I had said I was. I wasn't. I was very shook up. My anxiety had spiked. I was in shock. I was overwhelmed, in disbelief of what just had happened. No person should have to go through that at work. Work should be a safe place. For me, it wasn't anymore. In that moment, I was told from that friend, "I've seen a lot of bad stuff in my day, but that's harassment and bullying. If it isn't, I don't know what is." I nodded my head and I said, "I agree. This has been going on for a while. But I don't want to tell you too much because you still have to look after yourself." I tried to find calm and peace that day, but it was definitely hard to do for that entire shift. Ideas of telling myself that what had happened in the morning didn't actually happen in some attempt to try and justify that person's actions and the way it had impacted me churned through my head for most of the day as I tried to deal with the anxiety that now had me completely on edge, frozen for most of the day, unable to really do much effectively at work. Years later, I would have to try and understand this event that I again most likely had to suppress to carry on and heal from it. It is incredibly difficult to heal from all of these moments. The next stages I will talk about are having to step forward and get this individual help, and the flaws that exist in the harassment and bullying process within the RCMP. And again, this isn't to blame anyone. This is just to have a very accurate conversation about the way things went so that we can grow from this space, so that nobody else has to endure this and have to make the difficult decision down the road to leave their career early. So as always, when we talk about these heavy things, I'm gaining an immense perspective for the way these words are going to land on those that are listening to my story. Do not for 1 second let this story sway you from the belief that the RCMP can be a great organization if you are wishing to become a Mountie. If you are currently in, do not hold disdain for the organization, thinking that it is the worst place to be. If this story has impacted you in such a way that it has caused you to take on your own emotional feelings that are overwhelming to you, Recognize that. Take the break that you need. Bring in the breathing techniques that will help you to regulate yourself and find peace and calm so that you can go about your day and enjoy it. You deserve that. And so do I. And as always, thank you for joining me on this journey. The support continues to warm my heart and give me hope for myself. And that maybe one day the RCMP will be an organization that has openly acknowledged some of the issues that are within and dedicates itself to improving as an employer. As always, much love and take care. I hope you enjoyed this last episode. As we continue to grow, I would appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Leave a comment or a review and share this with anyone that you may know may benefit from what we are discussing. Have a great week, and as always, thank you for tuning in.